Great. Thank you very much, all of you, for that excellent presentation. I'm going to try to just share my screen. We're going to now move to the question and answer section of the webinar, and we've already received many interesting questions. So folks, do keep them coming, and do use the upvote function to move them up. So if everyone can turn their videos on, that would be great. There's a bunch of questions that I'd like to know a little bit more about whether temperature is the kind of overriding factor. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, I think Francis just mentioned that there are other issues like land and other aspects, but people are asking, for example, so the role of latitude is one. The other one is the role of precipitation as well. And then there's another one around sort of, drought and water resources. So if one or a couple of you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Sure, I'll try and answer that just generally. Primarily, yes, temperature is the predominant factor when looking at which varieties would grow where and whether somewhere is suitable for viticulture or not. There's an element of all else being equal in that answer. Francis mentioned topography, which is critical, soil, which is critical. The UK, if you take it as an example, 20 years ago was growing much hardier varietals, mainly Germanic varietals that didn't need an accumulation of quite such an accumulation of temperature during the growing season as the varietals that are grown now. So part of the answer is varietal specific. There are vineyards in Sweden and Norway at the moment. They're growing real hardy varietals such as Solaris that can cope with a much shorter but potentially warmer growing season. The varietals we're growing in the UK need as long a season as possible to get them as ripe as possible to make the wine styles that we're making. So there's many different factors come into that decision-making process, but primarily it's temperature that derives varietal suitability.
Thank you, Alastair. And could you say something about precipitation? Because I guess a lot of people have asked about extreme precipitation in particular, and I was wondering what happened in 2012, whether you can clarify climatically what happened in 2012.
Yeah, absolutely. So just generally on precipitation, extreme precipitation at certain times of the season are problematic. And in 2012, when vines were flowering, there was a high occurrence of rainfall. And of course, that's accompanied with dull, overcast conditions, which meant vines flowered very poorly. Your ideal flowering conditions are dry and warm. So that had a knock-on effect through to probably the lowest yield on record recorded in the UK being 2012. Generally, in terms of, I know there's a question about looking at precipitation in the future. In the UK, the problem, if we can call it a problem, is still that there's probably too much precipitation. We are looking at it through this project to understand precipitation trends in the next 20 to 30 years. There has been another project run by a group called Adviclim, focused on whether there would be a need in the future for irrigation in the UK, and they concluded that not within the next 50 years was the answer. So we have to bear in mind we're talking about a crop here that requires relatively low volumes of soil moisture and water to thrive, and therefore in the UK at the moment, lack of precipitation isn't a problem. It's probably the other way around, that over precipitation causes problems through disease and excess vigor, etc.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question here about, sorry, I don't know, it's an anonymous attendee, but how is it, it keeps moving, how is it for a producer to change the grape variety? Do they need to source new land to expand with a new variety? Presumably there's a cost implication to moving to another variety. I don't know if that's something that you've researched, particularly in the context of adaptation.
Yeah, I mean, you can do what's called top grafting a vine, which basically means keeping the rootstock and grafting a new variety onto it. Or you could replant, grub up and replant, or you could plant elsewhere. All three are options, but all three are both costly and very time consuming. So where replanting different varieties or top grafting has taken place, generally it's done in a phased manner, because you end up as a producer losing crop for potentially 4 or 5 years, through whichever means you choose to move to. As I say, areas of the world where it's become too warm for the varieties that are grown and they've wanted to replace or move to warmer tolerant varieties, it's done in a sort of very carefully managed way to ensure that there's still a market. I think just one more thing I'd add to that is the other challenge associated with replacing varieties is that areas that are well established grape growing areas of the world, for example, Saint-Emilion in Bordeaux, their whole market is known for a single variety, that being Merlot. To change a variety means you're changing your whole market offering, and that therefore is a huge regional consideration.
Okay, thank you. I have to, address this question. It's been very highly voted. So, what assumptions have your scenarios taken in terms of RCPs? I guess the question, is trying to figure out what kind of, what kind of emission scenarios are being considered for future climate, which I guess is then becomes the sort of recommendation for the industry. Are you presenting a range? Are you picking one RCP? I guess that's what people would like to be interested to hear.
Yeah, it's a super question. Maybe I can try and tackle that, Suraj. It's Steve here. So our focus, our main focus in the project has been in the relative near term, so 2021 to 2040, where, as we know, the choice of emission scenario hasn't been quite so critical. And it's a reasonable choice to make as well, I think, because as we said, the vine lifetime is sort of 20 to 30 years. So it is in that near term that we're most interested in, from the point of view of helping people to make investment decisions today. So if we do look further into the future, of course, later in the century, then of course the choice of emission scenario becomes much more critical. And if we rely on the RCP 8.5 scenarios, the high emission scenarios from UK CP 18, then of course it's possible that we may be overstating the amount of emission and of course the amount of climate change which accompanies that. So we focus very much, as I say, on the near to medium term in order to try and remove some of the uncertainty around emissions. And by doing that, we've deliberately tried to support the investment decisions of today.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I've got a question of my own, so I will take my my position as chair to ask one of the climate scientists and then another for the social scientists. So, Steve, it'd be very interesting to hear whether the industry makes use of near-term weather and climate information. So, I guess I'd be interested because you had some photos, for example, which looked like people were taking adaptation strategies to do with frost, perhaps using fire. Maybe you could explain that photo. But I guess my question is about whether the industry makes use of weather forecasts. I realize most of your work is looking for the long term, but is there means for them to learn about using not just weather forecasts, but also sub-seasonal, for example, forecasts? Which are becoming more prevalent by the meteorological community. And then for the social scientist, I'd be interested to hear are you using any theoretical approaches to understand how organizations are adapting? Because there's not a lot of research on how the private sector adapts to a changing climate. The work of Frans Berkhout comes to mind in the UK context for water companies and buildings, but there isn't a lot. So I wondered are there any particular, are you looking at particular signals, whether people are picking up particular signals, either, is it in the investment side or is it in, for example, through the scientific information that's being provided? So maybe, do you want to go first, Steve?
Thank you. Yes, I would say that there is good use of weather forecast information. In fact, the Vineyard managers themselves are being pretty proactive at monitoring conditions in the vineyard on a real-time basis in order to understand what the risk is on a given night. And so in a moment, I'll hand over to Alastair to let you know how Vinescapes as an intermediary is helping to supply mitigation equipment to the vineyard managers in order to avoid the worst of a frost event. In fact, I'll pause there and let Alastair tell you what they're doing to assist in that regard.
Thanks, Steve. So just quickly, as Steve mentioned, there's many vineyards have in-field weather sensors, which will issue a frost alarm when temperatures drop below a critical threshold on a frost risk night. And before that, many rely on services such as those that Steve's own company, WeatherQuest, provide to issue weather forecasts or frost risk forecasts. If a vineyard has a frost issue, there's a whole range of different frost protection options on the market that they could invest in, all of which are relatively costly and time consuming to implement, be they candles or bougies that are lit in the vineyard. I think we saw a picture earlier, or mobile frost fans, or some other device. But ultimately, if they can save, even just a small percentage of crop, that the value is significant.
And if I can just jump in on that second question, Suraj, apologies for the drilling during my presentation. We seem to have a momentary gap from the building work going on outside. What I'd say is, that's where our value chain lens comes in. So what we've been seeing is that, private sector actors are not adapting autonomously, and understanding the barriers and opportunities to adaptation really requires looking much more broadly at the business environment in which they're embedded. So our research is showing that relationships within the value chain amplify or buffer climate risk. And Laura Canavari at King's has written about this in value chains in the Caribbean, but otherwise there's not been much work done on this. So this is definitely a point that we're developing in our analysis. We're also looking a little bit about adaptation learning and the way in which this is happening over different temporal and relational scales.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll just take a couple more questions from the Q&A, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. We're a bit over time already, but there's some very interesting questions. One is around, so I'll ask them both. One is around how involved insurers are getting here in terms of transferring the risk of some of these likely extreme events. I mean, are insurers supporting the industry? It'd be interesting to hear that. And then the other one that Pete Falloon has asked is around lands, I guess. So I guess, what is the potential for expansion, given that there's going to be competition for land in the context of food production, but also in terms of climate mitigation in the context of net zero? So to what extent, Steve showed some pretty amazing figures of going from 5 million in 2018 to 40 million industry, and the hectares essentially, more than doubled in 15 years or 10 years. So so there's already been some expansion, but how big could this get?
I'll have a go at both of those, Suraj. Perhaps the last one first. As Steve mentioned, we've done some research and uncovered around 35,000 hectares of real prime, high-quality viticultural land in the UK, much of which is untapped or not in areas predominantly planted with vines. Even if all that was planted, we're talking an area about the size of the Champagne region in France, which isn't small by any stretch of the imagination. So there's significant opportunity in terms of land area. In terms of competition for it, it's not something we've really focused on or looked at. What we're seeing is a lot of landowners or farmers are looking for routes to diversify out of commodity-based crops, understanding that their interest might not be in the best interest of the country as a whole in terms of food supply. However, an area that's gaining traction in terms of research is looking at how viticultural land in the UK and elsewhere can be used for co-production of crops. Bear in mind that within a vineyard, only about 5 to 20% of the actual area has vines in. There's a huge interrow and headland area that could be used for other either biodiversity enhancements, public goods or ecosystem services, or indeed other crop generation. So there's there's a body of work starting to focus on that. Taking the first question about insurers, there's a few, I think the sector's, bear in mind it's still a very small sector compared to international standards in the UK. There's a few insurers have sort of ad hoc randomly requested climate data had to help verify claims about frost damage, etc. But we don't, certainly as a company, we don't really see much interplay or demand from the insurance sector to try and support the industry.
Okay, thanks very much, Alastair, and thank you for the rest of the team for a fascinating webinar. And obviously there will be publications and data coming out of this project, so do keep an eye on the website and do get in touch with our colleagues. I just want to finish off by advertising our next webinars. So next week we have a half-term special. Robert Nichols and colleagues will be talking to us about coastal resilience to flood and erosion hazards from their project. And then the following week we've got Don Monteith from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology talking to us about forecasting dissolved organic matter and building resilience to climate change. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. Keep up to date with the website and Twitter, so you can subscribe to the newsletter and stay up to date with developments in the program. And thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Suraj.
Thank you.
Thanks, Suraj. Thanks. Bye.